So, welcome to the BC LaRouche chapter meeting, September 24, 2016. Tonight, we're going to get somewhat provocative and discuss how we are currently witnessing the end of the Roman Empire, and also the end of the last would-be Roman Empire, the American president, the last would-be Roman emperor, the American president Barack Obama, and the system of emperors. From now into the future, there will be no empire. There will only be principles of development between nations which will govern the world, not empire. The directionality of this was established between September 2nd and September 8th in the three conferences that were held. One in Vladivostok, one in the G20 in China, and the third, the Asian Summit in Laos. So now I want to discuss this whole question of empire, where the idea of empire comes into play, and also where the idea of a republic comes into play, which is not an empire. A republic is not an empire. And this has been the central feature of the internal warfare inside globally extended Western European civilization. Now, the concept of empire or emperor, that is an emperor over the empire, is centered on a negative view of the human species as generally incapable of self-government by their very nature. And, of course, everything is done by those who are promoting an imperial system to make sure that people are not governing themselves but are in constant conflict or are incapable of governing themselves. Now, Plato's dialogues, especially the Republic, deal with the problem of a republic, and that you cannot guarantee that you will always have a philosopher king. You cannot guarantee it. And in between philosopher kings, you need some kind of principles and laws established by human reason and dialogue with the consent of the governed, with the consent of those governed. The imperial idea says no, ruling by law and the consent of the governed is not efficient. It requires too much debate, too much discussion, and too much confusion, and too many self-interests, and that these deliberative processes bog things down, are inefficient, and does not work in a crisis. Only the emperor vested in arbitrary rule can overcome and make government efficient. This, in the modern times, is reflected in the Napoleonic system. It was also reflected in Hitler's Führerprinzip, the idea of the leader. And this was also the idea represented in the unitary executive attempt to transform the U.S. presidency into an emperor, fascist emperor. this unitary executive idea promoted by the neoconservatives. And this concept of the unitary executive could not be promoted except in the context of what happened in 9/11 and the deployment of terrorism all over the world. Okay. In Rome, the first Caesar, who was killed by Brutus, and then the first major emperor came after, he crossed the Rubicon, which was the river, and the law was you could not allow Roman legions in Rome, in the Republic of Rome. And he crossed the Rubicon, bringing the legions into the Republic of Rome. And in the U.S., that Rubicon was crossed in successive extreme cases, the last one being the aftermath of 9/11 and the discarding of the United Nations Charter in the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Okay, now, that Rubicon was crossed. And we have been living since 2003, especially, in a situation where American legions, since 9/11, have spread all over the world and have worked in tandem with the growth of terrorism. $6 trillion have been spent on these wars, or $5 to 6 trillion, since the invasion of Iraq. Millions of people have died, millions have been displaced. This is not an accident. This is the policy of transforming the world into an imperial system with an attempt to establish the American president as the emperor on earth. And it didn't work. Okay, now the way emperors are established is oligarchical families around, in the case of the Mediterranean, decided that who was going to be the emperor, and then the legions would fight it out. Now, the British system, in its financial, propaganda, and other cultural assaults, etc., have tried to transform the U.S. presidency into an imperial system. Now, keep in mind that Hitler was operating on this idea of the Third Rome. The worst elements of Russia historically during the Russian Tsarist period were operating on the idea of the Tsar being the final ruler of the world, to some degree. The New World Order projected, after the fall of the communist system in the Soviet Union, was this New World Order of free trade, but it was also a system of an imperial system, where the world came to a stop. The world came under this system, which is very similar to Rome, and nations were destroyed. The refugees spread all over the world. You would have a system like Rome, and it would be the final Rome. It was the final Rome, and one of the agencies that is promoting this through their population reduction policy is the Club of Rome, and it's not an accident that it's called the Club of Rome. And they are one of the key agencies promoting this idea of a global Roman imperial system of a modern form, where nations are destroyed, you have city-states replacing them, and you have this overarching financial structure, and you have the enforcer being the President of the United States with the military capability. And this is essentially what is in the TPP and the TPIP, the European part with the United States, and the Pacific part with the United States, is a elimination of nations and the imposition of a system of law based on the financial system, but enforced through terrorism, and through the deployment of U.S. military personnel as well. Combination of all of these mercenaries and U.S. military personnel, and then a lot of it being mercenaries. Actually, most of it being mercenaries. Now, to justify and sustain an imperial system, there must be chaos, conflict in this regard, and there has to be fear, a fear in the population that they have to go along with this for their own safety and their own comfort. And this is brought out, by the way, in the new movie that just came out, Snowden. Some of this is actually quite revealing in the movie. Now, the presidential process in the United States is not based on an empire. It's based on a republic, but it has been hijacked and has been transformed increasingly, and especially since Bush Jr. and especially further since Obama. The current people running for president are not running for president. They're running to be the chosen emperor of the system. That is why their campaigns are so weird. Because they're not really running to save the United States. They're running to save the empire. That's why they're so weird. And people find these campaigns very weird. And this is one of the transformations we have accelerated since 9/11, the 15-year period. But it existed before. It's just been accelerated. Now you see this in the population, how a large portion of the population views Obama. And I know this from personal experience. I go out on the street and people say, I love Obama. I say, okay. Well, he's doing this, this is what he's doing. They look at you and say, no, I love Obama. But don't you see what he's doing? Yes, he's doing it, but I love Obama. Or he's being made to do it. Or some excuse is being given to explain, to exempt him from any blame for everything. And you have to ask yourself, would this be applied to Ronald Reagan? No. Would this be applied to Nixon, to Carter, to Clinton? No. To Bush? No. None of that would be applied to them. But this is different. There has been a change in the mindset of the population through the culture and through the way Obama presents himself. He does not, way he's presented. It's not how he presents himself, but the way he's presented. He's presented as a figure above criticism, and then there is the heavy hand behind the scenes that goes to threaten the senator, that goes to threaten the congressman, that goes to threaten the various people. You shut up, you do this, you do that, we'll kill you, and so forth and so on. And that is an imperial, so people capitulate to this. And they begin to develop a sense of themselves not as a citizen which is responsible for what happens in the nation, but as a subject who essentially, and I'm talking about the United States, is a subject who is basically, the president is the emperor. And we've had this situation with every constituency we talk to that previously would have mobilized against the policies that Obama represented, which required for the most part the Republicans to support. They would excuse Obama. Now, what is happening though is that as this system is collapsing, the forces have to rely more and more on this president and the power, the military power of this president to hold things together, and the threats coming from this president to hold things together. And the president of Russia, Putin, and China, Xi, on the other hand, are emphasizing, this is very important, the opposite of this. They're emphasizing the UN Charter in the case of Putin as the basis for relations among nations, and in case of Xi, the rule of law. And why are they saying the rule of law? Why are they saying the empire? Because they're saying that we cannot, when they use the term multipolar world, they're also attacking the concept of empire, but a multipolar world is not, is still not quite what they're really talking about, which is relationships among nations through global economic development that converge on principles which govern nations' behavior with each other for their mutual benefit. That is not an empire. And the reality of power and fear and drones, all of this is part of the empire, and the empire is coming down. Now, I'm going to go through three elements of the destruction of the empire and the people who are pushing the destruction of the empire, and bring an end to the empire, and bring down the emperor of the empire, or bring down the idea of the U.S. president being the emperor. And so I'm going to talk about three battles going on, but they're unified. They're not separate. They are unified. One of the battles is inside the United States. Okay? In 2008, 2007, actually earlier, 2008, we saw in a novel by a former senator, Keys to the Kingdom. His name, U.S. Senator, his name is Bob Graham, where he reveals in a novel form what was left out of the 9/11 Commission report. And way back in the 1990s, our movement was tracking the growth of terrorism, and we were tracking London being the center of the deployment of international terrorism initially, being the core. And we were on a campaign in the late 90s to have the United States declare Britain a terrorist sponsoring nation. And these terrorists were attacking Egypt. They were attacking all kinds of places. It was nominally Islamic, but it's never Islamic. So we put together. We found out about the Al Yamama deal between Prince Bandar and Margaret Thatcher in 1985, where involving arms sales to Saudi Arabia, involving the creation of a slush fund for terrorism. And that slush fund has played a very key role in the last 30 years in funding and developing these terrorist capabilities. So we found out about there being 28 pages of the 9/11 Commission report that were classified, which had a string towards Saudi Arabia. And there were also the families of the victims of 9/11 have been suing Saudi Arabia, and they were blocked by the fact that the courts ruled that you couldn't sue because they're a sovereign country. So we went all out since then to get the 28 pages released, to organize congressmen to read the 28 pages and get it released, because we knew that if this 28 pages were released and that you would begin to crack the fraud that the American people have been living under since 9/11, which is that their government is protecting an element of the personnel and so forth of the running the terrorists. So there's been a huge battle going on, and finally, enough congressmen read the 28 pages, and some of them said their whole view of history, of how history has worked, has changed. So eventually, some of the congressmen, after talking to an older congressman, an older senator who had read the Pentagon Papers, Mike Gravel, who's working with us, decided it was time for them to threaten to actually read the 28 pages in the Congress, which they can do, which would be a threat to the presidential power, but it's unconstitutional. It's already been ruled that congressmen can do that. So finally, the 28 pages were released, and when the 28 pages were released, Bob Graham said, "This is just the beginning of taking the cork off the bottle. Now we got to go for the cover-up of the FBI, all these circles that were involved in Sarasota, in Herndon, Virginia, in San Diego. So the battle now is escalating. So the next phase of the battle was to change the law, or to put in a law which allowed for the families to sue Saudi Arabia in the trillions of dollars. Now, mind you, it's not just the 3,000 people who are died. It's also the thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of people who died from complications of 9/11, from the asbestos that was in the air, and so on and so on. That's a huge number of people. It's hundreds of thousands. It's hundreds of thousands of people who are dying prematurely.
Yeah, that have 400,000 that have got serious diseases from it.
400,000 people with serious diseases from it. And this is New York City. This is the intellectual center of the United States. So finally this bill gets passed unanimously in the Senate, in the House, after being passed in the Senate. And it is presented to the President. And the President vetoed the bill. The Emperor vetoed the bill in defiance of the Congress. And on Monday and Tuesday, between Monday and Tuesday, the Congress is going to override that veto. And that will be the crack where for the first time the Congress has overridden a presidential veto. And this is very big because it destroys the invincibility and power of the Emperor over the Congress, which has gotten worse since George Bush. It's gotten much worse since George Bush. And George Bush was to some degree boxed in after his second term, not Obama. So essentially, this is very important. And I'm expecting Obama to go into an escalation towards war with Russia. They already did. So this is where we're headed. We're headed into a crisis in the United States where you have a grouping around Obama who was committed to going into war with Russia, and you have another grouping that doesn't want to go to war with Russia because they are afraid that there will be a nuclear holocaust if they do. And that's how serious the internal political crisis inside the United States is now developing in the United States as we speak. And the power of the invincibility of the imperial presidency of Obama will by Tuesday been smashed. Now, in that context, you have a financial crisis emerging where agencies are saying that Deutsche Bank and the European major banks are in worse shape than Lehman Brothers was in 2008. Now, the only way to deal with that in Europe and in the United States is to implement Glass-Steagall measures, bank separation measures. But if you implement Glass-Steagall type measures, bank separation measures, then that ends the power of the financial crowd that controls this global system. You essentially now restore sovereignty over, national sovereignty over the creation of money internally in various countries by the separation, you essentially, and it's only the first step, but that is now the next phase of the effort that has to be done in the United States, but also in other nations as well. And Glass-Steagall measures are in both houses of Congress, and the reason they have not moved towards implementation is people don't have the courage to confront the international bankers and confront the power of this Emperor Obama, which is not just a power over the United States, but it's a power that has been imposed on Europe. It's a power that's been imposed on Latin America. It's a power that has been projected and imposed all over the world. And that power is being challenged now inside the United States. But the people challenging it are still relatively timid. They have not fully challenged it, but it's convenient for them to challenge that power on the basis of the 28 pages and on the basis of this bill, because they can always tell the population, well, they can always protect themselves from the population, plus all these people have to run for office as well. So they have a cover. But the fact that Obama vetoed it because he had to. And now the Obama administration is going all out on the Senate to try to prevent them from having the 2/3 majority to override the veto. And that's going on right now, and there's pressure. The Saudis are going to meet the congressman. The Obama administration is now putting its entire weight behind their belief that they can get enough senators to back off for whatever excuse to prevent the override. And all the families of the victims of 9/11 have their delegations buttonholing the congressman the whole time. So there's this war going on Capitol Hill over this. And we will have a decisive defeat of Obama. I'm expecting a decisive defeat of Obama Monday and Tuesday. Okay, now.
There's also, sir, EU politicians as well coming to Washington as well.
To push for override, to support the veto. Yeah, so they're bringing in European politicians into Washington saying, you know, you have to support, you know, don't override. You'll make matters worse. So they're playing all kinds of games. So.
Well, the override has to be done in both houses, or
Yes.
Or at the same time.
No, both houses.
Both houses.
And
Yeah.
so it would be the first time a president veto has ever been overridden
In the Obama administration.
but in American history.
No, that's been done before
It's
many
been done
times.
before, okay.
But no one has had the courage to challenge. And Obama has never put himself in a position where he could be overridden. So this is coming to a head Monday and Tuesday. Now I want to go to the second prong, which is the military question. What the Russians have done, along with the Iranians and Hezbollah, in helping the Syrian government survive this incredible assault, is what they have done is they have essentially combined a military operation with a diplomatic operation. The military operation is to enhance the effectiveness of the Syrian armed forces with the support of Hezbollah and most of all Iran. But it's also a diplomatic offensive to get the United States to agree to resolve the situation. Now, the Russians are using what I call factitious advantage. We know, and you know, that you are coordinating and running ISIS, Daesh, or the Islamic State, as well as al-Nusra, as well as all these groups that say they're not with, but they are. We know, and you know that they are. Okay? But you don't want to admit publicly that you are doing this. This is not supposed to be public. You're supposed to hide it through third parties, whether the third party is Saudi Arabia or Israel or some other third party. But you're not supposed to say publicly. Now, if Russia were to come out publicly and prove that the United States was doing this, would the United States launch a preemptive nuclear war? So there's this game being played, which is very frightening, but the Russians are very clear. You cannot allow Daesh to take over Syria. That's the end. From there, it's downhill. The Obama administration is completely committed to that. It is not about the Free Syrian Army or any other line. It is about that. Now, in 2003, when Obama had organized and had given the green light to prepare for the mass bombing and destruction of Syria under allegations of the chemical weapons, then head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Martin Dempsey, went to Obama and said, it's going to come out that Syria did not use chemical weapons, that it was another party, i.e. a party connected to you. And that's going to come out. And you better think about this. And so, essentially, everyone weighed in. Obama got scared and took it to Congress, and it got stopped. Now, unfortunately, we do not have Martin Dempsey as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He has retired. The new chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the dummy Dumford, and this Looney Tune Carter, the Secretary of Defense, went before the Congress a few days ago and said they recommend that the U.S. impose a no-fly zone over Syria, period.
No, not you do not fly, we do.
Yeah, right. And everyone says, well, that means a war with Russia. And that is what it means. So we have the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and you have the defense secretary, who is not the same as the previous defense secretary, saying it has to, we have to do this, right? So meanwhile, John Kerry is carrying on these marathon discussions with Lavrov, trying to keep this thing from going into a nuclear war. And so you have this very crazy situation right now. It's very frightening. And the siege of Aleppo is very important because they have these people surrounded. And when the U.S. military attacked the Syrian positions in Dar es-Sor, there was simultaneously an offensive to break out by the Islamic State. It was not an accident. This was ordered by the United States. And it was an attempt to wreck any possible successful ceasefire process. Because once you have a successful ceasefire process in Syria, that's the end of the Islamic State. That's the end, that's the beginning of the end of the whole system. And everyone knows that.
It's more than that, Paul.
Yeah.
It's their assets that they have there that are from 4 or 5 different countries, which make up about 3/4 are mercenary of their
Right.
of the forces. And the Russians are starting to squeeze them hard,
Right.
and they're starting to take heavy casualties. These are the best trained guys in the world that they're now
Yeah.
engaging. And so what they don't want to have happen is a whole bunch of these guys to be identified or to be brought out in the open where they can say, see who's here, see
who's here, yeah.
see who are actually the people that are fighting.
Now, there are some reports, and I don't know how true it is, about the Caliber missile strikes. You think that's true?
Where they got the Mossad and the administrative aspect of the war
Yeah.
carried out, I think it's probably true.
Okay, did people hear about this?
They said that DEFCON reported it.
I don't know, but anyhow,
As Sputnik.
Sputnik Arabic.
Yeah, and
Okay,
ours.
so,
And the Iranian papers have posted it.
yeah, so there is, it's unconfirmed that the response of the Russians was to send 3 caliber missiles into the mountains, where there was a multiple national jurisdictional supervision of, electronic supervision of the
Of the warfare taking place.
warfare taking place.
The war room.
And it was being supervised in part by the Mossad. There were Germans, there were British there, US there, Turks there, and
Qatar.
huh?
Qatar.
Huh?
I think it's Qatar.
And Qatar, yeah.
I think you're right, yeah.
Qataris. So there is a response. Now, would the United States say you hit us when this was the coordinating center, intelligence coordinating center of, no, probably not. So this is the military part of this taking down the empire. This is going on now.
I have just one question, maybe the wrong time. You said that Lavrov and Kerry are still talking, is that?
Yes,
right?
yes.
Okay, because I heard a press conference where it didn't sound like that. Somebody asked Lavrov about Kerry and he said, we've already talked.
Now, they might have stopped talking, but I don't think they have.
stopped talking.
Huh?
They stopped talking. They're not
Yeah, they're still
anymore.
talking.
But they're
No,
supposed to
they
be in New
stopped.
York Monday
Yeah.
again.
Paul, she said they stopped talking.
They stopped. And the other thing is that Russians are thinking they probably even made up. They were negotiating it so that Daesh could plan that through this period of silence, Daesh could bring more troops inside and continue
Right.
the war.
Right.
So I
Still
don't think,
resupply.
probably they never even plan to have ceasefire.
Right, right. But Putin wants to keep the door open.
Well, he does, but what can he do?
Yeah, he has, because the issue is nuclear war. This thing could go to nuclear war. And so at some point, either the empire cracks or you have a nuclear war at this point. That's how serious it is. And that is why LaRouche is saying, now that Obama has vetoed this bill, he has committed treason against the United States, we have to move for impeachment. So the reason we are the ones moving on Obama and not giving him any slack and not saying, well, all presidents are like that and blah, 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 is because it's that serious. It's that serious a situation. His crushing Obama at this moment could stop a nuclear war because whoever comes in later will not have consolidated a capability to do the nuclear war at that point. There are too many different tendencies coming in. So now, this is where we are. It's very frightening, but we're going to get a break soon in this, one way or the other. Now,
Better one way.
So now I'm going to go through the next problem, which is the economic aspect. Okay? And what has happened is coming out of these 3 conferences is you have a very aggressive push to deal with the economic disintegration that's going on. Now, there is this huge bubble of debt tied to the shipping industry. And as trade between North America and Europe by sea declines, there's a debt implosion implicit in the downturn of trade, because most ocean carriers, they do not own their ships. They lease them from hedge funds, and the hedge funds tend to own the ships. The financial people own the ships, and then they pile a debt on top of the ownership of the ship. And so this whole thing is, the collapse of trade is very important. But there is an increase of economic activity coming out of Asia, which to some degree has compensated for the global collapse of the trade. So what is going on is the Chinese are on a massive massive, massive offensive, okay, into Southeast Asia, into India, into Europe, into the Middle East,
Canada.
Canada.
and into Canada, yes. And
Africa.
the Chinese have been blocked in their efforts to, they've gone to the United States and they're willing to rebuild America's rail infrastructure, to bring high-speed rail to the United States. It would be a great blessing to the United States. And they've been blocked at every point. Every point that they tried to massively intervene financially to help the United States, they have been blocked by the Obama administration. So they're now moving through Canada to try to come into the United States, fight economically. And what is happening right now is that the premier of China, Li Keqiang, went to Ottawa, met with Trudeau, got an agreement to have an extradition treaty so that they can go after their criminals that have come to Canada, but also to bring Canada into the AAIB, which is a big blow to the Obama crowd, but also you create a relationship, special relationship with Canada where, because of Canada's relationship to the U.S., it opens a door for China to come into the United States. And this is very, very big economic offensive, because what you do is you're providing a life raft for the part of the economy which is being destroyed. You're giving them an option. Because otherwise, if you know you're going to be destroyed and it doesn't matter and the system's going to collapse, so what difference does it make? But if you have some alternative to orient towards, where you're going to see growth and development of the productive power of your industry and your economy, if you're a serious business person, not a banker, who's snorting cocaine and playing with derivatives, then you're going to have a different attitude. So there is this tremendous, under the table economic offensive being launched by the Chinese at this time on a global scale. And for instance, the Chinese went to, this is how serious it is. The Chinese were the only major country putting forward, this is funny, an actual plan for the world to eliminate poverty by 2030, which was the so-called UN UNCTAD Sustainable Development Plan. Oh, we're going to eliminate poverty through sustainable development. Now, everybody knows that sustainable development is a code word for underdevelopment. We're going to develop your country without developing you. Everyone knows that. So what the Chinese have done is they've reinterpreted sustainable development and to be massive rail, massive infrastructure, massive development, and they're now captured the sustainable development movement and given it a very different content. And so they have presented a plan to the United Nations, which has been accepted by the United Nations, for a global development plan to eliminate poverty by 2030. And it's not a plan based on BS. It's not a BS, oh, wouldn't it be nice to eliminate? We're going to eliminate poverty by shutting your country down. No. This is about really doing it through an industrial transformation, through an economic transformation. They just managed to get an agreement with Thailand, finally, to begin financing the rail system from Kunming to Bangkok. Thailand has been a big issue. Thailand has been a big issue.
Is that the woman prime minister there in Thailand?
No, that's Myanmar.
That's Malaysia.
That's Myanmar.
Yeah, okay.
Myanmar, formerly Burma.
Yeah, she's a piece of work.
So now you have in mid-October, you will have the BRICS meeting in Goa. We had an organizer there in Goa talking at one of these events. Abni, yeah. And Brazil is being dismantled right now. And you have to understand that the key to the scandal that's dismantling Brazil through this judge, the car wash scandal, is the FBI and the NSA. They're playing a very key role behind the scenes in this whole takedown of the Brazilian PT, Partido Trabalhadores of Brazil. But they keep doing this. They're going to have a social explosion very soon in Brazil. But in the meantime, they're taking Brazil down. But this is a problem in South America because they have a lot of people in South America have gotten into a class warfare mentality, especially the upper and middle class. And you don't have a unity between the classes around a concept of developing the nation. Rather, you have they're playing the classes against each other, and they're going to have a civil war pretty soon in Brazil because you can't reverse what Lula and Dilma have done without causing a massive backlash in the population. But it could get very ugly. And then you have the Chinese putting forward the industrial development of Africa as a policy. And they brought in the Senegal and Cameroon into the G20 meeting because they were the part of the rotating heads of the Economic and African Union, the Economic Union and African Union. And you see this reflected in the Asian summit most of all, where basically they told the U.S. go home. In effect, the Asian summit, we will resolve these things on our own in dialogue with China or whoever else, and that's it. Duterte of the Philippines canceled the F-15. Duterte of the Philippines got the special forces out of Mindanao because they plan to crack down on the Abu Sayyaf apparatus. They don't want U.S. mercenaries, they don't want U.S. troops around to help the Abu Sayyaf apparatus. And then Duterte is now talking to China and Russia about military, about getting military capabilities from them, not to go to war with anybody, but to fight the internal drug crowd. And the drug crowd is the British Empire. And it is Obama. Obama is the British Empire. The drug crowd is the British. And that's huge. Now, in the United States, the drug epidemic hitting the population has skyrocketed, and also in Canada, is skyrocketing like crazy. And the major distribution elements distributing the drugs are the ones that were benefited by the Fast and Furious agreement, where the U.S. government sent weapons to the drug cartels in exchange for support for Obama's re-election. So you have this kind of thing going on in the U.S. and you have a real crisis in the U.S. developing among the youth and the drug issues. Drug problem is now penetrating the entire society, the rural areas, the urban areas, the suburban areas. And you're on the edge of a social explosion, and you have the elections coming up.
Well, we have a lot of drug problems in Vancouver.
Yeah, you do. And you have George Soros going around trying to promote the acceptance of drugs in general.
Well, I just want to point something out, because Vancouver is a port city. It is a world port city. Warren Buffett owns most of Delta Port. I'm not sure who the other owners are, but Vancouver is, and has been for a long time, the recreational drug capital of almost the world next to Amsterdam. And it's also the prostitution center, like almost legal prostitution. It's a profession. Meaning not just street, you know, like professional hookers, whatever. So, like, just to give some context, you know, because yes, it's a problem, but it's not. Being on a port city, the way Vancouver is, like any other port, lends itself to this problem economically, just by virtue of the port, and by virtue of the fact that the ports are highly unmonitored.
So,
On purpose.
Just also that it's been the major gateway to the whole market in the US has been through Vancouver.
one of the gateways, yeah. So now, I'm coming to the close of what I wanted to present, and I want to open it up for discussion. But the issue is the issue of an end to a system that has been plaguing the world, especially the European-centered part of the world, since the creation of the Roman Empire. And that system can no longer coexist with the human species. And so, we're coming to that decisive point. Now, once this empire is defeated, and provided we do not have a nuclear war, and provided that the collapse of society does not occur to such a degree because of the banking and financial crisis, then you will see the most rapid rate of industrial technological progress the world has ever seen. And you will see a future open up, which currently is not a vision of a future opening up, a positive vision of a future opening up, which currently cannot be seen by the masses in North America. They cannot see a positive vision yet. But we intend to create that positive vision with the help of our allies. And thank God they survived the free market system to be able to come into a position of moving the world in this direction. Because for the Chinese, it's do or die as well. They understand that they cannot fully develop their people and bring their people out of poverty without doing this on a global scale. They understand that. I wish this was understood earlier in the US, but it wasn't. And only a few presidents like FDR and Kennedy actually understood that that's the direction that the United States had to go if it wanted to have a future development. And it did it. So now we are at that point, and I think our chances are not terrible. I think I'm not going to say they're perfect, but they're not terrible. And I think whatever we do in Canada in that context will contribute to the bigger, Okay, so I'm going to stop there and open it up. Now, Plato's dialogues, especially the Republic, deal with the problem of a republic. And that you cannot guarantee that you will always have a philosopher king. You cannot guarantee it. And in between philosopher kings, you need some kind of principles and laws established by human reason and dialogue with the consent of the governed, with the consent of those governed. The imperial idea says no, ruling by law and the consent of the governed is not efficient. It requires too much debate, too much discussion, and too much confusion, and too many self-interests, and that these deliberative, and this has been the central feature of the internal warfare inside globally extended Western European civilization. Now, the concept of empire or emperor, that is an emperor over the empire, is centered on a negative view of the human species as generally incapable of self-government by their very nature. And, of course, everything is done by those who are promoting an imperial system to make sure that people are not governing themselves but are in constant conflict or are incapable of governing themselves. There will only be principles of development between nations which will govern the world, not empire. The directionality of this was established between September 2nd and September 8th in the 3 conferences that were held. One in Vladivostok, one in the G20 in China, and the third, the Asian Summit in Laos. So now I want to discuss this whole question of empire, where the idea of empire comes into play, and also where the idea of a republic comes into play, which is not an empire. A republic is not an empire. Processes bog things down, are inefficient, and does not work in a crisis. Only the emperor vested in arbitrary rule can overcome and make government efficient. This, in the modern times, is reflected in the Napoleonic system. It was also reflected in Hitler's Führerprinzip, the idea of the leader. And this was also the idea represented in the unitary executive attempt to transform the U.S. presidency into an emperor, fascist emperor. This unitary executive idea promoted by the neoconservatives. And this concept of the unitary executive could not be promoted except in the context of what happened in 9/11 and the deployment of terrorism all over the world. Okay. So, welcome to the BC LaRouche chapter meeting, September 24, 2016. Tonight, we're going to get somewhat provocative and discuss how we are currently witnessing the end of the Roman Empire and also the end of the last would-be Roman Empire, the American president, the last would-be Roman emperor, the American president Barack Obama, and the system of emperors. From now into the future, there will be no empire.